This season of A 30 at 830 is entitled Strange Fruit, addressing the violent erasure of Black bodies. Tonight's episode is entitled The Retelling of Our Truths. This episode explores the ways we are systematically erased through the retelling of Black experiences. Tonight, hi Asia. Tonight we have an emerging scholar whose work focuses on educational equity and racialized organizational policy. Asia Ivey examines the inequitable structures that reproduce structural racism in public schools and spotlights the skills and expertise of progressive educators who strategically combat schools' oppressive policies and practices. Asia Ivey is a Ph.D. candidate in the Department of Sociology at the University of California, Davis. Asia is a UC HBCU fellow and an alumni of the Robert Wood Johnson Health Policy Research Scholars Program. Go on, Asia, you go on. Go on, yes, give her some love. Asia currently serves as a graduate student researcher for the Violence Prevention Research Program, which we are deeply appreciative of the work. While in this role, she has co-authored a comprehensive empirical report on community violence intervention programs that utilize outreach workers, where authors discuss barriers to implementation and provide recommendations for operational effectiveness. Asia led the development of a co-authored research commentary focused on how community violence intervention strategies can mitigate structural violence in urban public schools, which is currently under review with theory, research, and action in urban education. Asia is an alumni of the Robert Wood Johnson Health Policy Research Scholars Program, where she received 4 years of robust training on how to translate empirical research for policymakers and how to determine the key motivations of relevant stakeholders. In that program, she had the opportunity to practice policy pitches with legislative members and to write op-eds related to her research. Crib community, you know, we always have some bad mamma jamma guests, and I want you, as you always do, to give Asia Ivey a warm crib welcome like nobody can. Thank you very much. Asia, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Of course.
Thank you. All right, so I'm gonna set it off with, like we do with all of our guests, and really just asking, what drew you to this work?
So I am the daughter, granddaughter, and niece of educators. So education has always been the cornerstone of my life. It was always instilled as a core value from the very beginning. But I never really understood why I never attended the same schools that my mother, for example, would teach at. She always taught at Title I schools, and I would always hear or witness the various challenges that she was trying to mitigate with her students. I would see her collecting extra food at lunch to give to some of her other students that may be hungry, or taking students home from a basketball game. At the time, I didn't realize that she was trying to mitigate gaps in the system, but I knew she was always trying to meet the needs of her students. It wasn't until I had a classroom of my own, doing freedom schools or doing student teaching in Title I schools in the West End of Atlanta while I was at Spelman, that I really got to see the lack of access and opportunity that our Black students were really facing. And then also the fact that teachers were still trying to bridge these very same gaps that my mother was trying to bridge back when I was 4 and 5 years old. And so I really thought that my work was going to be centered around Black students and the challenges they were facing and their barriers to achievement. But while I was in grad school, I actually had access to this really dope cohort of educators who were creating their own schools using really innovative models and really going against the traditional system.
Yeah.
And I really took the time to interview them and learn how they were planning to achieve equity with these new models. And at that time, I really got to see that, one, educators are the experts in all of this, but that they're so rarely called to the table at the organizational level or at the policy level to really lend their expertise. And so that's what really evolved. That work really evolved into my dissertation that I'm doing now, Frontline Educators Organizing for Equity and Critically Reimagining the Future of Public Education. And it's really focusing on the way that educators navigated the pandemic in particular, the challenges that they face, and the ways in which they utilize either formal or informal resources to maintain equity or to combat inequities that were taking place. And so, and then also that work is really highlighting the importance of Black educators as well, the historical significance of Black educators as pioneers of the public education system, but also their unique positionality as having once been students in the K-12 system and navigating that system, and now as educators using those experiences to really inform how they relate and provide tools for their students to go on and critically engage with the world we know today.
It's so interesting. There were so many, and thank you so much for sharing that. I was resonating on so many levels with your experience, because I know we're sort of new to one another, but I see you, Spelman, Hampton University. I see you, HBCU. But also, you know, I was struck by, you know, my family as well, all educators and all social workers. It was just, right? But that sort of root of perspective, of being of service, of investing in our communities in such a profound way, has truly continued to inform who we are, how we move, and also the innovation that we bring, right, to the discourse of what's important in terms of addressing how we address structural inequity. So I so appreciate that. And I'm excited to read your work. I'm excited to read more of your work. So I want to take a deeper dive into some of your work. This season, as you know, we are focusing on the many ways in which Black bodies are erased. And time and time again, we have seen this erasure take place, as you alluded to, within educational settings. For example, we need only turn to the banning of books, curriculum sanctions that disavow Black history, discounting, as the case is here in Canada, the Black Canadian experience of enslavement, and the creation of false narratives that suggests that enslavement was somehow beneficial to Black people. I mean, I'm giving a strong side eye, but anyway. So what is the sort of premise do you think, for the resurgence, or perhaps the continuation, if we're really real about it, the continuation of the erasure of Black bodies in these forms? What's going on here?
I would say that what we're seeing is what Dr. Carol Anderson would call a white rage response, right? So in her op-ed and in her book, she discusses the way that Black rage is often highlighted during seasons of social unrest, like what we saw after Ferguson in 2014. But she challenges that and pushes back and says, actually, that is white rage at work. And so we've seen these white rage responses since the passage of the 13th Amendment in 1865. Ever since African Americans have made any significant strides towards democracy, we have seen deliberate counteractions to ensure that progress is significantly halted, if not significantly slowed, if not completely prohibited. So, for example, at the end of the Civil War and Reconstruction, we got the Black Codes and Jim Crow. At the end of Brown versus Board of Education, we saw the mass layoff of Black teachers, an effect we're still seeing today, and a significant widespread closure of public schools due to a refusal to integrate the teaching force or the student population. And then we know with the Civil
Or to
Rights
even
Act,
compensate them. Compensate them.
exactly, and that's always been an issue. Equal compensation, and then today just ensuring that their expertise is valued at that level. And then we saw it even more with the Civil Rights Act of 64 and the Voting Rights Act of 65 that led to the war on drugs, war on crime, the community disenfranchisement, and the mass incarceration rates that we see. And so when we think about the racial health inequities that were highlighted during COVID-19 and the types of conversations that catalyzed, coupled with the international outcry that came from the Black Lives Matter movement due to the murders of Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, and George Floyd, these situations in tandem led to unprecedented conversations around systemic hate, to the point where you even had CNN discussing institutional and systemic and structural racism.
Yeah.
Now, this would lead to any significant material condition changes or policy changes for the Black community, right? We got some like Target swag deals and some rainbow crosswalks, but it did lead to significant spillover into the public education system in a very, very significant way. So we know the public education system was one of the most significantly impacted institutions due to COVID-19. And it was a battleground for making sense of what was taking place in all of these major cities across the country when it comes to the Black Lives Matter movement. Now, you would think that the classroom is like the most appropriate landscape to like have robust and critical conversations about like social and civil issues and what's taking place. But the moment that educators attempted to leverage their agency, their power, and their exactly, to try to either advance their expertise or to educate their students about what was happening, we get the white rage response that is a ban on critical race theory. And we know critical race theory was never even taught in K-12 public schools, but it has been used as this umbrella term to encompass any and all things racial inequality and any attempts to hold the country accountable for historical and contemporary racialized harm.
Yeah. You bring up so many and I'm just also reflecting on just my own education. I'm dating myself, but I remember our history books. And it was a paragraph, or let's up the ante and have, Black history, or like a potluck, or Black History Month, which is the shortest month of the year. That's when we celebrate all the things, but it's only the 5 individuals that have made contributions, to the civil rights movement. So there are all these spaces and places and ways that I think that you've highlighted how even in a system which even is supposedly supposed to allow freedom of thought, we are censored. We are deliberately erased or minimized in this way. And I really appreciate you bringing up the historical context of all. This is not new. This is not new. So thank you for that. Thank you for that. I want to keep going. I want to keep going because I have so much is coming up. So I want to talk about, just ask a question. So based upon your experience in school environments and your focus on the use of structural violence, the structural violence lens to address issues of racial injustice, I'm wondering if you could share your thoughts on what you believe are the short-term and long-term impacts of erasing and suppressing Black history in the ways we just discussed. And I can see so many layers of these impacts, but I just want to hear from you what your thoughts are.
So my first thought is the continuation of misinformation and the perpetuation of anti-intellectualism. And so we see that our textbooks are being changed, history is being revised, but I think it's really important for students to have a holistic and critical understanding of their history so they know how to situate themselves within it and how to navigate the world contemporarily. This also helps students see their value and really connect more deeply with their cultural identity. But I want to make a note that I think Du Bois put it very, very nicely that we don't need a curriculum that just parallels the Eurocentric curriculum that just praises all of our historical figures, right? We need something that's much more holistic.
Yes.
So they need to understand their history beyond a legacy of harm and disenfranchisement, right? They need to understand the resistance that took place, and that resistance took place at every milestone of white rage.
That's right.
But on the other hand, and they also don't need a history that completely absolves the oppressor of their harm. Because I think that lends itself back to the narrative of the ideology of Black inferiority, and that we are passively in this position by happenstance. And so I think that narrative does just as much harm as one that is only rooted in violence and oppression. And then when I think about long term, I think about things that we're already seeing happening right now with the rollback of affirmative action, with the banning of CRT and other sanctions around books. And I think that we are on a slippery slope when it comes to censorship and constitutional First Amendment rights. And I think teachers and educators are only the first step in this country attempting to rewrite history and to paint themselves in a more altruistic light.
Yeah. I agree 100%. And I think also the long-term consequences are that we provide additional fuel to the fire to continue to breathe life in the lie, and we see it take place in so many policies. I mean, we're seeing it take place, to your point, in some of the rolling back of things that we've been, begging for to address issues of structural inequity, but then people are vested in believing the lie. And I think it goes back to your initial point. Believing the lie allows for the idea of fueling fear, false fear, and also power and privilege, right? To continue to take place. So it's really, I appreciate you inviting that into this space, because it's not just the short-term impact for Black folk, it's the long-term impact for us as a society. So everybody needs to be accountable. So Amy, I wanted to talk a little bit about some of your work specifically in your article titled "Building the Transdisciplinary Resistance Collective for Research and Policy, Implications for Dismantling Structural Racism as a Determinant of Health Inequity." You discuss your development of a transformative racial equity framework and emphasize its importance to understanding structural racism. So I'm going to ask two questions if I can get them in before we're at the hour. First, can you tell us a bit more about the transformative racial equity framework? And then the other question I have is, can you explain how this framework can help to address the erasure of Black bodies through book sanctioning, curriculum restrictions, some of the things that we've mentioned tonight?
Of course. So the Transformative Racial Equity Framework, or TREF as we call it, is an extension of an ecological systems framework, which is just rooted in the idea that social environments influence human development. And the framework really encourages researchers to take a holistic perspective on how individuals are affected by or affect physical, social, political, cultural systems. So the way our framework deviates from the ecological systems framework is it demonstrates the way that racism and resistance are bidirectional in each of the layers that we. So we're presenting layers of ideology, so white supremacy, meritocracy, different layers of governance, different organizations, and then individuals that operate within these organizations. But the framework is not only showcasing the way racial health and equity, for example, exists in these various layers, but the ways in which racism informs each layer and the way individuals interact with those various ideologies, institutions, organizations, but that resistance is also taking place. And so we're trying to account for the racial health and equity that exists, but also the agency of individuals to resist structural oppression at every level. And so I would say that go ahead.
No, please, go ahead.
So the framework, I would say, helps you to identify the most relevant stakeholders at each level. Educational equity is a multifaceted, complex issue that has implications in various institutions and things of that nature. So it's not just enough to just know the way that schools are ideologically racialized, right? But it's important to have race scholars at the table that can discuss the way that schools are racialized and the way racism is reproduced through zero tolerance policies and standards-based accountability, for example. Same way, it's not just enough to have the people from governance at the table. You want someone that understands the way that these policies are being created and what is informing these policies, but you need them along with the race scholars. And then it's also just not enough to have people at the organizational level. You need you need to talk to principals and your dean of curriculum and instruction, but because they're the ones that are taking those policies and applying them to the respective schools and organizations. And then it's not just enough to just hear from the students that are being impacted by this, right? You need to hear from stakeholders at each level because it's such a complex issue. And I think this segues well into your next question.
But I also, what I appreciate about this, and I think about, you know, when I started this journey of my own research, I won't say over 2 decades ago, but really honing in on the root cause of a lot of this in terms of that's really about anti-Black racism and how that manifests strategically in systems at every pass, policy, community, you know, all of that. But moreover than how we as Black folk are keenly aware of that and then navigate within the system. But without that sort of those threads of connection, right? We often, as a society, and I also think it's rooted again in anti-Black racism in terms of our reaction to the behavior of someone. You are doing this thing versus understanding that someone is navigating as a result of trauma after trauma after trauma. They are navigating systems of oppression that are necessary for their survival. So I so appreciate the fact that you're bringing that into the work through an educational lens. Absolutely. And so, I'm sorry. So I want to get into the transdisciplinary work question because that's a strong element within this framework. And I want to ask about just how do you think the transdisciplinary work across disciplines, what does it look like? What should it look like if we're going to address and prohibit the erasure of Black bodies?
So working across disciplines really looks like individuals leveraging their own respective expertise to create a shared language and shared understanding around a multifaceted issue. So, for example, when we were creating the TREF, we were coming from a multitude of different disciplines, sociology, social work, urban planning, education. And based on our own discipline-specific theoretical backgrounds, we had our own definition of structural racism. We each had our own definition of our own understanding of how structural racism operated within our own field of interest. So in order to create this framework, we had to develop a shared definition around structural racism, racial health and equity, so on and so forth. And to do so, we explored each of our discipline-specific theories relevant to our respective research and practice, and then from there co-developed the framework. And so we were trying to challenge the way that this work is always done in such a siloed way. Sociologists work on their own things, psychologists work on their own things, education scholars work on their own things. But you cannot tackle an issue as complex as structural racism or educational inequity if you don't have each of these players at the table with a common shared goal and shared language and shared understanding of one, what the issue is, and then how can we get to the next step without necessarily returning back to our siloed spaces, institutions, organizations.
That's right. I agree 100%. It gets us nowhere. And everyone else in the chat is agreeing because I'm seeing fire, 100 hearts. So they are co-signing on what you're saying. I want to really thank you for sharing your perspective, your work with us this evening. I want to encourage the Crib community to follow your work, cite the sister. because again, you know, we are constantly uplifting fundamental discourse that truly will allow us to be free. And so we've got to begin to really take a deeper dive into the frameworks that allow us to do that and to move accordingly. I want to ask another question that we ask of all our guests, in particular as Black researchers. We are often driven to do this work as a means of responding to the urgent, deeply rooted call to serve our communities who continue to be over-policed in many forms. With that sense of urgent responsibility comes a level of resolute perseverance and complex traumatic assault that is persistent. So how do you care for yourself while doing this necessary work?
So when I tend to get overwhelmed from just the state of public education or just the state of the world, I like to return to Octavia Butler. Well, I do two things. One, I like to return to Octavia Butler's work. In particular, her two pieces, Parable of the Sower and Parable of the Talent. Those pieces really ground me in her, not only her Afrofuturism, but the way that she envisions abolition. It's a way for me to really get re-inspired for knowing in my way of knowing that there can be something after this. The work is grounded, is set in California, and so I always feel like we're on the precipice of what Olamina was facing. But at the end of all of that, they were able to come back together and find community, find kinship, find spirit with one another once again after everything had, so to speak, burned down. And so that keeps me, I would say, kind of motivated for the work. But I think the thing that really helps me rest is when I return to Trisha Hersey's work, Rest is Resistance. Keeping her mantras, right? Keeping her mantras really first and foremost. I'm not here to labor for capitalism. That's not what I am meant for. And the purpose of my rest is not to further on capitalism's agenda. My purpose of rest is to return to my dream space, to reclaim the dream space of my ancestors that was stolen from them. And so whenever I just feel completely outdone by this work, I remember that I am more than enough just for the simple fact that I'm here.
Yes.
I'm worthy.
Yes. Yes. And yes. I mean, can we get some mic drop? Can we get some, that is it. That is all of it. I love all of it. And I've been, toying with this idea myself coming back from sabbatical about the purposeful protection of my peace. And what does that mean? Trying to find spaces and places where I'm not working 7 days a week. I'm doing something fun for myself, for my spirit, my soul. And that is necessary to do this work. I feel like this is a theme throughout 30 to 830 season 5, but it's also a theme that I've been sharing with many of my students as we do this labor of love work. So again, my sister, I thank you for the work that you do, and I'm so excited to see what the future holds for you. But thank you so much for joining us tonight. I appreciate it.
For having me.
Appreciate it. Crib community, as always, from our crib to yours, stay safe and keep well. Thank you.